This video is to discuss probability distributions. Do not mind my pupper in the background. She likes to bark. To discuss probability distributions and how to calculate a mean, standard deviation, and variance for these distributions in section 7.2. So I have one of the problems pulled up here, and this one's specifically asking for standard deviation. And as we learned in chapter 4, there is a difference in the calculations for a sample standard deviation versus a population standard deviation, and same for variance. Now, back in chapter 4, the directions explicitly mentioned whether you were to calculate a sample standard deviation versus a population one, but you will notice in 7.2 that that is no longer explicitly mentioned. It just says calculate the standard deviation for the following distribution. And the reason for that is because all probability distributions are populations. That is one of the two criteria that we have to pass to prove that it's a probability distribution, is to ensure that all the probabilities are included. And we do that by making sure that they add to 1. So knowing that we have 100% of the probabilities accounted for inside these distributions is how we know that each one of these are populations. So every single one of the calculations in 7.2 are inherently population standard deviation or variance calculations. Now, I wanted to show you guys how to get a mean, standard deviation, or variance for a probability distribution inside Rguroo. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to copy my data by pressing the copy data button. And then I'm going to head over here to Rguroo. I'm going to select the first cell in the dataset editor. Notice that it is not a live cell where I can see the cursor blinking. It is a solid cell. And I'm going to do Control V to paste, or Command V if you're on a Mac. Now, these distributions I've noticed don't paste nicely. X is a variable, so it should be a column header with every one of the X variable data values listed below in the column. Remember, every column represents a variable and its associated observations. Same with P of X, the probability of that variable should be the column 2 header with all of these probabilities listed in a column below that column header. So we do have to type these in manually, but luckily, the way that it pastes, we are able to copy the values a little easier because they're right in front of us. We do have to make sure that they are still in the same pairing though. So notice that -5 is paired with a probability of that occurring to be 0.2. So when we type these out in a vertical format, we have to make sure that -5 and 0.2 are still in the same row. So double clicking is going to make the cell live for you to type. And I'm going to type all of the X's in order. So -5, -4, -3, -2, -1, and 0. And then I'm going to come over here and type the probabilities. So the first one that is paired with -5 is 0.2. The next one is 0.3. After that, we have 0.1, 0.1, 0.1, and lastly paired with the 0 is 0.2. Once I have those all typed, I can just single click and hit delete to delete out these unnecessary numbers now. And again, when you have more than one variable, it is in your best interest to label those variables so that when we're using the functions, we are able to easily discern the difference between var1 and var2. We might not remember that var1 represents our actual variable, the x, and var2 represents the probability of that x happening. So I'm just going to rename these real quick. I'll just name this X. And again, to rename, you're going to hit the hamburger by the variable name and click rename. Now, if I type P of X in mathematical notation, I will get an error that says this is not a valid variable name. Okay, parentheses are not used in variable names in the R programming language. So you can either change that by just putting px together or doing p.x. However is appropriate that Rguroo will accept the variable name. Okay, remember, anything that it tells you is not valid is because this is powered by a programming language called R, and the same quirks that the programming language has does pertain to the front end of Rguroo. Okay, now I'm going to want to save my data set. So I'm going to save this as a 7.2 practice example because I came from the practice mode in Hawks. Save as. Remember, anytime that you have a new data set, it's always good to check your data window to make sure it is officially there for you to access so that you know it's saved properly. Okay, so now in 7.2, you're going to be asked to calculate a mean for these distributions, a standard deviation, and or a variance. So we are going to come here to analytics, analysis, and back to our numerical summaries, which is where we went in chapter 4.1 and 4.2 when we were calculating all this stuff, and the other half of chapter 4, all of chapter 4. So I'm going to select my data set. Okay, I noticed that, oh man, only P of X is populating in my variable window. Why isn't X populating? And this has to do with how we originally pasted our data into the data set editor. So because that first column originally had column headers, it had X and P of X in there as its data values, the column was automatically set to a nominal level or categorical, which is why it's not populating in the numerical window here. So I need to go back to my data set. So notice again that these tabs allow me to go back within one logged in session of everything I've done. And I need to make sure that this variable is being seen as a numerical variable and not a categorical one. So if I click on this variable, oh, I don't even know if I need to click on it, honestly. I need to go to this button here where it says variable properties. I'm going to click on variable properties and it lists all the variables. The ones we care about are X and P of X. So X, when I click on it, I notice that it has been labeled a nominal variable, which remember the nominal level of measurement is only for qualitative or categorical variables. And that happened because when we first copied and pasted, there was X and P of X in that column. There were letters and not numbers. So it automatically said, oh, this column is going to be designated categorical. But because we've already changed that and now everything in this first column are numbers, we need to tell our guru, hey, that's changed. It's now numerical. While we're in here, let's make sure that P of X is set correctly. I was pretty sure it was because it did populate in that window, and it is. Now notice when we make changes that the name of my data set turns red. It says that anything you've changed has not been saved yet. So we do have to click our Save As again. My title turns green, saying we're good to go. Any changes you've made have now successfully been saved. And we come back here to our numerical summaries function. Now I am going to have to reselect the data set. Okay, notice it says, oh, you want to change the data set. It does recognize that even though I'm selecting the same name, that the data set has changed because we saved new settings. And I can see my variables now populating in my numerical box. So remember, when we are doing a mean, this is related to when we talked about a weighted mean back in 4.1 and 4.2, the variables don't go in the same place. The variable itself gets moved over here to the selected column, but the frequency variable, in this case, that'll always be the probability variable, is going to come here in the frequency box. Remember, when we select a variable here and a frequency, our guru automatically knows to calculate a weighted mean, and that also includes a weighted standard deviation and variance. So next up, after we have our proper variables in their spots, we hit our univariate menu. And depending on what the question wanted, we would select what we want it to calculate using both the X variable and the probability. Again, notice I'm only selecting population variance and standard deviation because these are probability distributions, which are always populations. Hit our eyeball, and now we have everything we could possibly want to answer the questions in 7.2. This particular question was asking me for standard deviation. I believe it said round to 1 decimal place, so my answer should be 1.8. 1 decimal place, yes. Let's type it in and make sure. Yay, well done. So this is how you would handle copying this data, rearranging it properly in our Rguroo, also renaming our variables, categorizing our variables properly so that they show up in the correct data windows, and getting mean, standard deviation, and variance for a probability distribution.